On the 13th of September, Ngā Ara Whetū co-hosted a symposium on the challenges of inequality and environmental degradation with the research centre Juncture, Dialogues on Inclusive Capitalism, which is based in the business school at the University of Auckland. The symposium was held in the Sir Owen G. Glenn building, and it saw experts discuss these twin challenges, drawing upon the work of French economist Thomas Piketty. Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart of Management and International Business convened the symposium. The first half saw a keynote address by the Honourable David Parker, the former Attorney General, who was followed by Professor Craig Elliffe from Law, Professor Susan Watson, Dean of the Business School, and Council of Trade Unions Economist and Policy Director Craig Rennie.
Kia ora, everybody, and welcome to this seminar, which is hosted by Ngā Ara Whetū and Juncture. I'm Professor Jacqueline Beggs, an ecologist and co-executive director of one of the hosts, Ngā Ara Whetū. So today is dear to our hearts as we delve into the critical intersections between income inequality and environmental degradation, drawing on the insights of French economist Thomas Piketty's work. These issues have far-reaching implications both for social equity and environmental sustainability, and we're excited to engage in meaningful and respectful discussions around how these dynamics shape our world. We hope today's event spark new ideas and collaborations that contribute to a more just and sustainable future. Thanks heaps for coming along, and we're really looking forward to your participation, and I'll pass over to Billy.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Kia ora koutou. I'm Billy Withberg. I am one of the Associate Directors of Juncture Dialogues on Inclusive Capitalism, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the Business School. So it's a great pleasure now to hand over to Natasha Hamilton-Hart, who is going to chair the first session for us.
Welcome everybody. I'm really glad to be able to introduce this panel, and it's a really topical issue. I think I've caught about 8 articles in the news about tax in the last week. I don't know if you orchestrated that, but obviously it's something that we're hugely interested in. So this panel, which has a focus on Piketty and New Zealand, I guess is going to deal with sort of multiple strands that can be drawn out of Piketty's work as it might be applied to this country. I'm going to hand the floor in a moment to the Honourable David Parker, who is going to provide the keynote. Now, I almost feel like, you know, this guy doesn't really need any introduction because he is a very well-known figure in New Zealand politics over the last 2 decades, but perhaps most pertinently for today's discussion. He is the person in the Labour Party who was associated with work in the Treasury and in the Revenue Department to undertake a systematic study of the distribution of wealth and income and tax incidence in this country, which a couple of years ago when it came out caused quite a bit of discussion. He's been involved in a variety of initiatives to put the tax reform on the agenda in New Zealand. So today, David Parker is going to talk about Thomas Piketty and climate change, including relevant research by the Inland Revenue Department and the Treasury under the last government into wealth, income and tax paid by high wealth individuals in New Zealand. So, David, the floor is yours.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Natasha, thank you for that introduction. It's lovely to be here. It's ironic for me to be standing here talking about Piketty, climate change and inequality, because I'm standing nervously in front of professors, deans, doctors, postdoctoral fellows, when I only have a couple of old bachelor's degrees. And, you know, that's inequality. But I'll give it a go. Conspicuous consumption amongst the super wealthy undoubtedly shows the world that in general those with the most pollute the most. Private jets produce 10 times as much greenhouse gas as a commercial airline passenger. Super yachts are even worse. The mega yachts of the mega rich are longer than football fields. Even the newly launched hydrogen fuel cell super yacht called Project 821 pumps out the greenhouse gas pollution. Despite costing a whopping 600 million euros, it still can't carry enough hydrogen to power its 119-metre hull across the ocean on its fuel cells, and so uses fossil fuels on voyages. Its green hydrogen fuel cells do power what are called hotel functions. It is said that the R&D from the project will flow through to Norwegian ferries, but given we have the first hydrogen fuel cell ferries operating elsewhere, I'm not convinced the super yacht was a necessary development pathway. Perhaps the most extreme example is private space travel, and with billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos privatising space, blasting ever more frequently through the stratosphere, the effects on climate are becoming more significant. Piketty makes the more fundamental point that some of that huge amount of wealth concentrated at the very top of wealth holders needs to be redeployed to help civilization avoid catastrophic runaway climate change. He has two main reasons for this view. One is about money. The transition to lower emissions costs more than the status quo. Doesn't always cost more, but it sometimes does. And when it does, the money has to come from somewhere. A real example is the cost of a battery electric vehicle compared with a petrol or diesel car. The price is converging, but is still apart. Prices matter. After the clean car discount was cancelled by the incoming government, the proportion of new petrol and diesel-like vehicles imported into New Zealand rose massively from 42% in November 2023 to 60% in May 2024. The proportion of plug-ins, hybrids and battery electric vehicles plunged from 58%, more than half, to just 40%. If for argument's sake the difference between the whole of life cost, including fuel, of a battery electric vehicle was $10,000 more than a petrol one, then the 600 million euros spent on that one super yacht, $1 billion New Zealand dollars, could instead pay for that difference for 100,000 cars. One more super yacht or 100,000 fewer petrol cars? Which is better for the planet? Yes, some are philanthropists, albeit on average at levels that are less than even modest tax rates. And yes, some invest in the weightless economy, and others are striving to green energy systems. Nevertheless, it remains true that the consumption patterns of the very wealthy often drive higher emissions. It's also true that globalisation has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty and reduced the gap between rich and other countries. But substantial inter-country disparities remain. And we know that internationally, if developing countries take the fossil fuel intensive pathway, we all fry. It's a shame that the Clean Development Mechanism and the Kyoto Protocol did not survive, because that provided a rational way to help the world reduce emissions cost effectively. In New Zealand, our emissions trading scheme linked to the Clean Development Mechanism until the Kyoto Protocol failed, after the USA did not ratify Kyoto 1 and Kyoto 2 didn't proceed. While the Clean Development Mechanism had implementation flaws in early years, including corruption, those were fixable. International aid and climate finance, while very important, are an inferior alternative to reducing emissions in other countries. Inferior because they don't mobilise as much capital. Piketty's other, perhaps more important point is that increasing inequality within countries also undermines societal support for the changes needed to clean up the means of production and to green our consumption choices. This should not be a surprise because it's a subset of a wider truth. Increasing inequality takes societies backwards, not forwards. Before diving into some of the detail, I'm going to put up two general slides. The first, simply to show that New Zealand taxes are average compared with OECD countries. Taxes affect the shape of the economy. Gross inequality also impacts both the shape of the economy and many social outcomes. The economic effects include more speculation rather than productive investment. It's one of many factors behind asset price inflation for land-based assets. Paintings and rare cars are another example where eye-watering prices are paid by the super rich as they outbid each other. get the shape of taxes wrong, and productive investment drops. Look at this graph for new capital formation in New Zealand over time as a case in point. I'm not going to describe it, but it paints a sad picture. The anti-social effects of high inequality are clearer still. I don't have time to rehearse the voluminous evidence in support of this. Many have, I'll mention two. The Spirit Level by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. It described how more equal societies almost always do better. It presented data showing that once a country escapes absolute poverty, relative inequality within a country drives physical ill health, mental illness, obesity, violence, drug abuse, prison populations, lower home ownership and distrust. Tony Judd's Ill Fares the Land, a pithy book. Its title was drawn from a poem penned by Oliver Goldsmith in the mid-1700s. Ill fares the land to hastening ills of prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. I know the language is old-fashioned and that men means men and women, but a decade and a half after Judd critiqued the paradoxical resurgence of unfettered capitalism after the GFC, that sentence still sends a chill down my spine. Ill fares the land to hastening ills of prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. It captures a raw emotional truth, and I lament that since that book was written, inequality within countries has got worse. Lower income people in New Zealand and elsewhere have long lived close to the edge. What has changed is that the middle has become ever more pressured. And over the last decade, attention has moved from income inequality to resultant wealth disparities. Wealth inequalities pile up year upon year, just as the investments of the super wealthy compound in value, so does wealth inequality. Donald Trump may not have drained the swamp, but he did speak to a disaffected middle class. This is deeply ironic, given that he features in Peter Goodman's Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the Planet. That book describes tax data leaked in the USA, and I quote, "The details affirmed the audacity of the undertaking. In both 2007 and 2011, Jeff Bezos paid zero in federal taxes. Others who achieved that distinction included Elon Musk, George Soros, and Michael Bloomfield." In this age of misinformation, allied with the disproportionate influence of the wealthy like Rupert Murdoch, it can be hard to move the dial. Surrogate organisations describe tax as theft unless it's paid by someone else to protect their property rights. Equality of opportunity is redefined to exclude social mobility, and when it comes to sharing the fruits of our economy, inherited privilege dominates over working and saving. I'm not talking about a few nil each, but hundreds, even billions of dollars, hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars. So it's easy to drop into the cynicism redolent in the phrase some attribute to Mark Twain, lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so it can be hard to break through the power of the status quo. But occasionally someone does break through, and in my view, that accolade deservedly goes to Thomas Piketty. What a treasure to read. Romantic literature, the Belle Epoque, the Great Depression, the effect of wars and post-war policies that made a difference, and their demise, and the consequences we now bear witness to. The sweep of history augmented by recent data. Genius, in my view. He proved the math, and people know that maths does not lie. R is greater than G, and I'm going to come back to that. In New Zealand, we tested the validity of Piketty's findings for New Zealand with a detailed study based on actual data, not models based on population-wide surveys, which are necessarily simplistic. If they're not simple, most people can't fill them out. If they're simple enough for most people to fill out, they actually don't capture the complex financial affairs of people at the top end. Actual data. This was born of limitations in the Household Economics Survey, which is the main survey carried out by Stats New Zealand at the top end. Back until we did the study, there had only ever been one person found in that survey with assets more than $10 million, net wealth more than $10 million, and that person, I think, had assets of $20 or $30 million, in a country of billionaires. It shows you how flawed that survey is for assessment of wealth, income and tax at the top end. Since then they've had, I think in the subsequent 4 years or so, they've found one other person. But again, nowhere near the top. So how do we change to do this? Well, we changed the law to allow the Commissioner of Inland Revenue to collect information for policy purposes. Until then, it was argued they could only do it for tax administration purposes, and tax intermediaries could say you're just fishing, you're not entitled to that information. We modelled it on a UK law, and we made it compulsory that information to be provided. We allocated $5 million, it's a very complex study, $5 million for the work, and data was sought for 350 high wealth individuals. This is essentially the main person, their life partner, dependent children. I'm going to have to go over 5, I'm sorry. But I think this data is important. So the information gathered could only be used for the study, not tax enforcement, and we had high levels of compliance. Sorry, I should go back. The study covered the high wealth individual, their life partner, their dependent children, and trusts, where they controlled distribution or the appointment of trustees, which does the same thing. In practice, the information ordinarily came from their tax intermediary, accountants and lawyers. An expert reference panel and OECD advice guided analysis. The data collected enabled the network of legal entities that each high wealth individual invests through to be identified. And this is often very, very complex, involving multiple trusts, partnerships, and hundreds of public and public and private companies. Now, the IOD had in-depth information for just about all of these. The complexity arose from putting the puzzle together, which net assets and income and tax should be attributed to whom. Those in the study had net assets, a median of $106 million each, and an average of $276 million. Net of all liabilities, massive. What are their sources of income? Of course, the high wealth individuals are the most successful investors in New Zealand. They can buy the best of advice, they're long-term professional investors, they're well connected, they can invest in projects unavailable to others, they have the ability to leverage assets, to spread risk and to minimise tax. And you see on this that essentially for this sector of our population, 93% of income is investment returns. Before I come back to what the results of the study were, I'll cover companion work carried out by the Treasury on the 90% plus of the population the government already had good information from the Household Economic Survey and other data. This too was a big piece of work, and it was carried out by the Treasury, and it's published in a number of working papers. And it showed that New Zealand's got a progressive tax rate, and it also gathered other data. So this here shows the difference between marginal tax rates, which is shown in the red line, and the average that implies as you go up the income scale. So if you look at the blue line, and if your income was $180,000, your average income tax on your taxable income, not all income, your taxable income would be, about a bit more than 25%. So we've got a progressive tax system which applies to what is defined as taxable income. A lot of people who talk about tax focus on this, and it's important, but it's only part of the story. GST is a very big part of the New Zealand tax system, and therefore a big part of the tax that most Kiwis pay. The slice changes a bit over time, but in every year New Zealand's GST as a proportion of the total is about the highest in the OECD. Our GST is very broad, it covers just about all goods and services. Groceries, electricity, clothes, appliance, repairs, etc. Doesn't include rent, your mortgage or your savings. They're just about the only things that it doesn't cover. And so most people spend about 2/3 of their income on GST, inclusive goods and services. GST is 15%, 2/3 of your income being spent on that. Your effective GST rate as a proportion of your income is around 2/3. That's shown on this graph, which goes from deciles 2 to 9. Decile 1 is excluded because the data is a bit distorted by loss-making ventures. If you extrapolate that line out for people who really are in decile 1, their effective GST rate is about 11%, You go up to decile 1 and it's dropped to about 7.5%. There's a big tax wedge difference in that in the progressive VR system on that alone. The system is also, why you can't put decile 10 up there is because the average is highly misleading it there. This is the average in the top decile, 6.4%. This is the project population. Their GST consumption expenditure as a proportion of their income is under 1%. Now, going back to the general population, the income system is augmented by transfer payments, benefits and the like, ACC payments, accommodation supplement, superannuation. So the statutory definition of taxable income also excludes a lot of capital income, including for people who are not in the high wealth group. So all of these aspects were included in a study by the Treasury to provide a fair comparison. And they ran lots of different examples by ventile, 5%. Now I'm not going to go through this obviously, but you can see, if you look at this, you can see that we've actually got a progressive system including transfer payments up to about $80,000 or $100,000, which is when working for families and the likes phases out depending on the number of children you have. But you can see here for sort of a middle class, medium income earner that's outside the benefit system, their average effective tax rate excluding GST is about 20%, say 20-25%. This was done before the 38% rate, and so this now would be higher for people who are on high salaries that are at the top end. So there are a myriad of examples, but you can see that for the middle class, really 22-25%, plus that GST that I showed you, about 8 or 9%, that level. So a total of low 30s. So, in comparison, what did the high wealth individuals pay? Bearing in mind that the middle are paying a total tax on all of their income of 30-34%. For those in the group, the income tax was under 9%, under 10%. It was actually under 9%. GST averaged under 1%. So their total tax as a proportion of their income was under 10%, a third of the rate paid by the middle class, and less than half the rate that is paid by a low-income single person. Other interesting discovery from the study: the larger the proportion of a company owned by a high wealth individual, the lower the ostensible rate of taxable income and profit. How can that be right? These are the best investors in the country. Strong evidence of the structuring of investment portfolios for tax minimisation purposes. Nothing illegal going on here. Sensitivity analysis was done to compare the last economic cycle with earlier ones. The view of officials was that it wouldn't make much difference. So we've already got proof that most of the income of the high wealth individuals is reinvested because their fortunes are so large and their incomes are so large they can't spend it all on consumption. And that's proven by that GST figure that I've already given you. They're careful with money, and in truth it's hard to spend that much money. Once you've got a house and a holiday home and a few cars and a boat, imagine trying to spend 20k a week in the subsequent years. You'd have to be full-time on the supermarket trolley and do overtime at the mall. Even then, you'd only be spending $1 million a year. So if your income's $10 million and you were spending that million a year, you're spending a tenth of your income on GST, inclusive goods and services, and your GST is 1.5% of your income, not like 8 or 9 that it is for the middle class. And if your income is $100 million, your GST would be 0.15% of your income. Remember, for most, it's about 8 or 9%. So if you're not spending most of your income, what are you doing with it? It's reinvested, either by way of retained earnings or investments in other entities, which brings me back to R is greater than G. Piketty was right. R is greater than G. What does this mean and why is it important? R is the rate of return on large pools of capital after inflation and tax. G is the economic growth rate within countries. Those returns on large pools of capital are largely reinvested rather than spent, and Piketty was right about what this means. When R, the rate of return on large pools of capital, is greater than G, the growth in the economy, the share of the wealth at the top grows ever larger and the share of the wealth held by the rest of society decreases. Ditto, the income from that wealth, the same thing happens. The transfer of wealth to the top is compounded. The maths is irrefutable. The conclusion is grounded in data, not general surveys or models, actual data. More and more of this is sitting in trusts. For the first time, we've got decent data on this because we changed the law to require trust disclosures as well. Over $450 billion plus is now sitting in trusts, intergenerational asset holding vehicles. So Piketty's work led to what we now know. As a result of the IRD and Treasury work, Treasury was able to better calculate the share of wealth sitting at the top end. Turns out this was a lot more than was previously thought. Top 5% of households own 40% of all wealth, the top 1% own 20% of all wealth in New Zealand, and it's compounding. Officials told me they believe the 20% is likely to be an undercalculation rather than an overestimate. If that 20% keeps going up, whose share is going down? There are only 100% going around, and the contrast is stark. The bottom 50% of households now hold just 6% of wealth, and although there's an age, stage of life component here, the overall position is clear. That 6% can't go down much. The saying goes, you can't get blood out of a stone. So increasingly, it comes at the expense of the middle, most of the people in this room. Piketty's work has enabled the world to better understand and highlight the raging inequality we have at the top end, which is why I was pleased to accept this invitation to your forum on Piketty and climate change. Inequality is a serious problem, so is climate change. They're linked, and both must be addressed. Thank you. Sorry.
You've already given us a lot to think about and put a number of balls in the air that I guess we all care about. You know, the issue of inequality and fairness, the issue of addressing poverty and material deficits, underlying which we also have the problem of maintaining economic growth, and then the enormous investments in decarbonising our economy if we are going to address the challenge of climate change. And, you know, the work that has been done to put some New Zealand data onto the figures for wealth distribution, I think, is incredibly important. Of course, what we don't know yet, because we have only had this as a one-off exercise, is what the trend looks like. Although other people have worked with New Zealand data over time, and so the question of whether the intuitive model that, you know, returns to wealth compound, and therefore you have exacerbating wealth inequality over time, it is not clear where that trend lies. And so that would be one of the things I think that would be really interesting to address either today or in another forum. But we also have perennial questions about what is fair and what is feasible in the area of taxation and steering society's investments towards more productive and less greenhouse polluting kinds of technologies. So the rest of our panel, and I'll take them in the order that they're on the program. So the first speaker will be Professor Craig Elliffe, who specialises in taxation in the law faculty here. And before becoming a professor of law and tax law in particular, he worked in the industry with two of our major tax and law firms. So he's written very well regarded books on international taxation and the topic that you all wanted to know about, dividend imputation. We also, and I'll introduce all of our panellists at this point, we also will hear from Professor Susan Watson, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, which is my boss. And she is an expert in corporate law and corporate governance and has recently written a terrific book on the evolution of the corporate form and function over the centuries, which intersects a little bit with my own interests in the station trading companies of previous centuries. And so she is going to share some of her recent work, I understand, in this area. And last but not least, we have Craig Rennie from the Council of Trade Unions, who is, Craig is an economist and director of policy for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. He is well known as having had a long and close connection with the Labour Party in policy development and the development of its tax policy and budgets over the years. So it would be and other related sort of instruments such as fair pay agreements. So it would be very interesting to hear your perspective as well.
Tēnā koutou. So I have 5 points, so I've got a minute for each of them. The first is just to agree with and accept the points on the social impact of inequality. Can I add to David's analysis, with which I totally agree, a question of social mobility, because I think that is quite a big thing in the New Zealand demographic. We used to be a country where I think people could become more capable through education, through opportunities that were accorded to them, and social mobility is one factor that I think has declined as a direct consequence of inequality. The second is to comment on the excellent work that was done by Inland Revenue and to give credit to David. There aren't many international studies done on the rate of tax. There was a similar study in the US actually leading to almost identical results, but they are few and far between, and they are not as authoritative as the New Zealand study. Interestingly, David, you might like to add to your narrative on the GST that the very wealthy, of course, don't pay GST on overseas travel, which is a reasonably significant component, I would imagine, of their spend, such as, but of course, investment rather than consumption is the story for them. The other point to note is that effective rate of tax includes unrealised gains. So if you look at the income figure there, it includes unrealised gains. Now it's unrealistic, to be honest, and I'm not trying to torpedo those results, but no one, apart from our New Zealand FIF rules, taxes unrealised gains around the world. So in terms of unrealised capital gains, the Italians tried briefly, unsuccessfully, for about a year to tax unrealised capital gains. So there is an issue there to the extent to which that economic number of income represents both realised and unrealised gains. Now that's material, of course, for the discussion on whether we should have a wealth tax or whether we should have a capital gains tax. I'll phrase it that way. Of course, there is the third alternative. We shouldn't have either of those two things, which is the stance of the current government. So the third point is to paint you the picture of fiscal sustainability for this country under the existing tax settings. The short answer is the OECD, the IMF, the departing Secretary of the Treasury have all said it doesn't add up, it will not work. And the reason for that largely is because of our ageing demographic. Very simply expressed, when you have a huge reliance on earned income from PAYE and salary wage earners, and you have a declining working force and an ageing population, and that ageing population has increased healthcare spending and increased superannuation spending, you need actually to maintain the existing arrangements, you need a higher percentage of tax to GDP than is the current setting. Quite clearly, as the current trends are, we are actually in a position of a budget deficit, and the borrowing is increasing rather than decreasing. In other words, unless there is a change, when you think about the effect of the pure economic, on a balance sheet perspective, we are going to have to borrow more or tax more to fund the existing arrangements. Now, other people will say, well, okay, we'll just simply spend less. We are trying that right at the minute. We see an example where there is a lot of spending less going on. And I can't listen to the radio in the morning without hearing the latest health dynamic and crisis. What's it going to be like in 10 years' time or 20 years' time under these existing settings? I think the situation is dire. Now, the fourth point I'm going to make is that there are, in fact, some theoretical solutions to this because we've diagnosed the problem, which is one of inequality. And can we justify the taxation of capital or wealth? The answer is yes, of course, from a theoretical perspective. Not only are the people who are wealthy getting more from society, therefore they have a higher benefit, and therefore they should pay more tax. So under the benefit theory, that's justified. But also, of course, under the ability to pay theory, which is the ability for someone, which justifies progressive taxation. So then we deal with the practical, my last point, the practical solutions. Now, it seems clear to me that in terms of our tax base, we do need some form of tax on capital. But the big question is whether that should be a wealth tax or a capital gains tax, at least to my simple mind. Now, we can either go down the route of heresy or orthodoxy. And I'm afraid to say that those people who think a wealth tax is a really good idea is, in my view, that it's a heretical idea. And the reason for that is because whilst theoretically it works, it's going to be a major issue from a practical perspective. What is the unit you're going to tax? Liquidity. How are you going to force people to sell their assets in order to pay the tax, which is not an issue with the realised capital gains tax. They actually have the money. Thirdly, there's a valuation issue. Are you going to require a valuation of the assets every single year? That's an enormous cost and a big drain on the economic success of the country. And lastly, and most importantly, it's a question of capital flight. At the minute, there are only 3 sensible countries. I'm excluding the South American countries, there are 2 of them. There are 5 countries in the world that have a wealth tax. This has been a marked decline since the 1990s when there were 12. So people can go anywhere to escape this, and the obvious place they will go to is Australia, because we have, New Zealand citizens have an automatic right to live there. So if we think we're going to collect the level of income that might be projected under a wealth tax without a dramatic economic consequence, then in my view, you're dreaming. Thanks.
Thank you very much for putting some of the trade-offs on the table. Professor Watson, please.
Thank you. I think Piketty demonstrates to us that wealth always concentrates in the hands of a few over time. But the cause may not be people, or at least human beings in general, are in many ways victims of inequality and climate degradation rather than its primary cause. We may not live in the Anthropocene age, but in the capitalocene. The wealthiest persons in the world are not human beings, they are corporations. Fortune Global 500 companies amount to half the world's global economy, and that doesn't include all the other corporations and companies that exist in the world. It staggers me how often the important role that corporations play in the distribution of global wealth and the exercise of global power is not seen. Corporations own the data and AI. Corporations have advantages that natural persons do not have because they can be eternal, so the R will get greater than G for corporations over time more than humans, because people die. When people die, the assets generally are distributed. And corporations are weightless. They can go anywhere. But of course, even though they can go anywhere, they have an impact where they go. And the economic and political power and influence big corps wield makes it challenging for states to regulate and tax appropriately. The impact of the primary tool of capitalism, the business corporation, increasing concentration of wealth and power cannot be overstated. Now, Piketty touches on the role of corporations in shaping inequality. He argues that the rise of corporate power and the concentration of capital has had significant implications for inequality. And he does that in his most well-known book, Capital in the 21st Century, but he builds on that in his more recent book, Capital and Ideology. And in that book, he expands his historical analysis to provide a broader perspective on how societies have structured their economies and corporate systems over time. So he traces the development of property rights from feudal systems to modern capitalist economies, arguing the way that societies define and protect property rights, including corporate ownership, have a profound effect on inequality. And Piketty also analyses through his studies periods of relatively low inequality in many Western countries from the 1950s to 1980s, attributing this in part to policies that constrained corporate power and promoted worker interests. Piketty also explores alternative corporate structures such as cooperatives and state-owned enterprises and their impacts on inequality. So throughout his historical analysis, Piketty pays attention to the evolving ideological justifications for different corporate structures and their relationship to inequality, arguing that those justifications often serve to maintain existing power structures. So by providing this historical perspective, Piketty aims to demonstrate that current corporate structures and the relationship to inequality are not inevitable or natural, but rather they are the result of specific policy choices and historical developments. He argues that understanding this history is critical for imagining and implementing alternative systems that could reduce inequality. So this helps us understand that the corporate forms and level of inequality brought about through corporate forms are not unchangeable and inevitable. Certainly shareholder primacy, which Piketty does not favour, facilitates most effectively the growth of financial value in the corporate form. But the corporation remains therefore the form that attracts investment capital. But incorporation, the benefits it brings, are not a God-given, no strings attached right through states. Through incorporation, states bestow incorporation benefits, most particularly that they are separate legal entities, which allows them to exist forever, the status of legal personhood, and on essentially what is a fund of capital contributed by shareholders. And that benefits indirectly, contributes to inequality because of the owners and controllers, the shareholders and corporate executives benefit, but I would say they benefit almost indirectly because of the corporation itself. So we must bear in mind that existing capital will not favour legal forms that do not grow value over time if other choices remain available. But we should not ignore the impact that corporations have on our planet. As Piketty highlights, societies and states do have the capacity to reshape economic institutions, including corporate structures, to promote greater equality.
Rights are a political choice. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko Craig Rennie, I'm the Economist and Director of Policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions Te Kauri Mahi. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you, David, for your presentation. At the start of this, I'm actually really pleased that R is greater than G is actually on the screen. It's super helpful to me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm also on the Real Party Policy Council, so we're deep in the middle of this work, and in my spare time I like annoying politicians on Twitter. I'm indebted to my colleague Bill Rosenberg, who had this job as the Economist at CTU before me, for a piece of work. But I just want to start with a small story, if I may. Politicians, I don't know if you know ministers' offices, they have fabulous shelves that have glass doors so you can see the books behind, so that ministers can show off their reading. They can show you how intellectual they are. And I won't tell you which ministers have books that they haven't read on the shelves behind them. But Minister Parker, when he was Minister of Revenue, had lots of books on his shelf, but he had one book on his desk. And that book was Piketty's Capital. And I can tell you, not only had he read it, every second page had a post-it note attached to it, telling you what was inside the book. So I can guarantee if one of us understands Piketty's Capital, it's the Honourable David Parker. 1991 was not a vintage year in New Zealand. As my colleague Bill Rosenberg showed, if we draw a line between 1932 and 1991, we can see the share of the economy that goes to workers and the share of the economy that goes to capital moving around. But it's basically a straight line. Since 1991, the share of the economy going to capital goes up. and the share of the economy going to workers in the form of wage and salaries declines. Every year. It doesn't close. It's like a crocodile's jaw. It just keeps going wider and wider. Why is that important? Because R is greater than G. It is the showing that R is greater than G, because every year the proportion of the economy going to the workers is less and less and less. Why is that important? There are 136,000 children in New Zealand who live in material poverty. That means they don't have a winter coat, they don't have 2 pairs of shoes, they regularly don't get fed 2 hot meals a day. They live in cold, mouldy houses. Their family don't go and visit the doctor or the dentist because they can't afford to. 61% of the children in that group, their parents are in work. If we look at unemployment, unemployment's due to rise by 43,000 this year. If we look at the forecasts, it will rise even further. 50% of 15 to 19-year-olds who were in work 2 years ago are no longer in work. We reopened the borders after COVID, and employers stopped using 15 to 19-year-olds as spare labour. We've just closed the Just Transition and the Equitable Transitions units. I don't know why we have a Just Transitions and an Equitable Transitions unit, but we do. They're both the same thing. In government, so we're not delivering the climate change solutions. We're not delivering the work that we were supposed to be delivering. We've got 7,000 fewer public servants, and we've just spent $4.1 million on a treaty principles bill that's already doomed to fail, at the same time as we've just stopped the work on the Taxation Principles Reporting Act. So we can't find out the information anymore that we were able to find. All of these things are driven by R is greater than G, because who benefits from those decisions? Now, it appeals to me tremendously that I can say, I agree with Craig. I don't often get to say that. But I agree with Craig that this is a consequence of the fact that we have tremendously short-term thinking in government, and particularly around the economy. We have particularly short-term thinking about how much money we need to invest in health, in education, in housing, in the welfare state, in child poverty. And that's a consequence of the fact we don't have a good idea about what a good economy looks like. And so when David Parker produced the High Net Wealth Individuals piece of work, I was there in a room very much like this at Victoria University with the journalists, and the journalists' look on their faces, they were horrified to discover anything that anyone with eyes or ears and who'd looked outside could see. And so I'll leave you with this. So the lessons from Piketty, to me, are really quite straightforward. It's to take a long-term view. It's actually the value of economic history as a study. And the lessons from 1991 onwards in New Zealand is that something needs to change. The status quo isn't cost-free. It's not working right now. It's enriching a few to the disadvantage of everybody else. It's created a country in which this is the best country in the world, according to the World Bank, to be in business. I want to live in a country where this is the best country in the world to be in work. Because if we deliver that, we deliver a great community. Everything that we do in the economy is a choice. Everything that we do here is something that we choose to do. It's not natural, it's not evolution. We get to make these decisions. Taxation is a decision, and we need to make different decisions about taxation, because if we don't, we're going to continue the path that we're on since 1991. And if I can drop I wouldn't be here if I couldn't drop one political point, so forgive me. We need to have a better conversation about the economy in New Zealand. We need to have a better conversation about taxation in New Zealand. There are 779 days until the next election. We need to have that better conversation, because I don't want New Zealand to be the UK. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of part 1. If you'd like to hear more, please make sure to tune in to part 2 on the challenges of inequality and environmental degradation through the lens of French economist Thomas Piketty.